They told me that anger was a fire you could never put out with your bare hands, but I learned to cup it, to let it simmer, and then to turn its heat into something that could bake bread for people who had cold hands. My name is Leila. I grew up in a house that smelled of cardamom and old books, in a neighborhood where everyone's life threaded into everyone else's like embroidery. My father was the sort of man who greeted neighbors by name and kept a jar of honey at the ready for anyone who dropped in. For years I believed our small family was a knot of safety, until the knot began to fray. It started with my brother, Yusuf. He was 7 years younger, quick with a joke and slower with consequence. In his 20s he made a choice that cracked something in him. He fell in with people who liked the rush of quick money and the brisk clarity of us versus them. He got involved in a fraud scheme that hit our community's small businesses, including the cooperative my father had helped start. When the truth came out, the town had a name for him, a bitter adjective that made people look away. I remember the first time I felt shame that was not mine. We stood outside the mosque after a midday prayer, and the shopkeepers who knew my father's hands tightened their faces as I passed. For the first time in my life, I saw pity and judgment in a stranger's eyes, and they felt heavier than any hand. Inside me something turned. Not the soft turning of compassion but a sharp, defensive twist. How dare they look at me like that? How dare they look at him like that? Hatred arrived like frost. Quiet, crystalline and sharp. At night I would sit by my window and rehearse the speeches I would one day give to those who had judged him. I pictured the words like stones I could sling. I dreamed of the moment when people would have to eat their apologies. Felt righteous. Felt hot. But fire burns both the arsonist and the house. After a week of this new identity, of righteous anger, I walked past the cooperative and saw a woman with tired hands stacking crates. Her name was Amina. She ran a small stall that sold herbs and breads. Her husband had been one of the businesses hurt by Yusuf's mistake. She did not glare at me. She did not thank me. She simply kept working, methodical and careful, like someone who had chosen labor over complaint. I found myself staring at her hands and for the first time feeling small, not from shame but from a new recognition. My brother's error had 1,000 small victims, and their lives were not waiting for my vengeance to be complete. That night I went to the prayer hall, not to perform a dramatic act of contrition but because my father had always told me that quietness could be a doorway. I remembered him saying once, that mercy was not a weakness but a kind of strength that rebuilt. The words in the quiet room did not arrive as commands. They arrived as a memory, a scent of bread, the soft cadence of my grandmother's voice. I sat and listened to the silence instead of rehearsing replies. In that silence, hatred lost some of its gloss. I decided to change the shape of my response. If anger was a fire, I would not use it to burn down the house. I would let it light a stove that could cook for the people who had lost warmth. It felt practical and small. And these days practical things are often the most courageous. The first thing I did was the most humiliating. I asked for Yusuf. For weeks he had been in hiding or on the run, sometimes both. He answered my message with distance, with a thinness of a voice that had learned how to say sorry syllables like coins tossed into a fountain. When he came home, he was not the swaggering boy I remembered. He was smaller, and there was a hollow in his eyes where humor used to live. "Why now?" I asked him, not soft but not cruel. "Why come back to a house where your name tastes like ruin?" He looked at me like a man who had studied himself and found nothing he liked. "I couldn't keep running," he said. "And I don't want to run from you." He stayed, at first because there was nowhere else that fit him. He started to work with our hands, repairing the cooperative's woodwork, counting accounts with the care of someone who knows how to measure both shame and ledger lines. Sometimes his fingers trembled when he handed a repaired crate back to someone who'd lost money. He apologized as if the sound could sew things back together. Apology is a thread, and threads alone do not repair quilts. I found a different way to help him repair the world. I insisted that we do not retreat into family shame and private apologies. I told him that restitution required more than money. It required witness and work and the stubborn patience to build trust where it had been corroded. He had to confront people he had hurt. He had to listen to their anger, not respond with justifications but with steady attention. He swallowed pride and sat across from Mr. Faraj, who had run the cooperative's ledger for decades, and Mr. Faraj read him the list of accounts and what trust had cost. Yusuf wrote checks. Yusuf sat in meetings. Yusuf learned to answer questions where he had once offered evasions. The town noticed, not in a sweeping, cinematic way. At first it was simply the softening of a few brows, then a cautious nod when Yusuf spoke at a community meeting about restitution plans. Someone called our cooperative and asked if we could accept volunteers to pack donated goods. I suggested we do the packing and then deliver with our hands and faces open. There is a kind of humility in delivery that conversation cannot replace, showing up with boxes and names and the willingness to sweat for what you broke. I also learned a crucial lesson from Amina and Marta, that giving does not erase accountability. Repair must be honest. We organized open sessions at the cooperative where people could ask about fund flows and see the books. Yusuf stood and answered questions in public. He read the schedule of restitution and agreed to hours in the pantry. There were people who would never forgive him, and that had to be respected as well, but there were others who understood that repair was a process and chose to participate in it. One afternoon, an older woman named Sadia, who had once refused to sell her herbs to the cooperative because she felt betrayed, came to the pantry. She did not speak much, but she fixed a bowl of lentils and added extra cumin with the sort of precision that comes from practice. She handed me a small packet of dried mint and said simply, "We all need the garden tended." Those words were like a benediction. They implied no grand absolution. They recognized the work. Soil must be turned, seeds planted, water given. The act was neither heroic nor theatrical. It was quiet. It was daily. Day by day the arc shifted. Yusuf learned to be steady instead of charming. The cooperative recovered some of the lost contracts because people saw the work and decided that fairness mattered more than a single echo of the past. The ledger grew less scarred. Our father, who had watched all this with a cautious patience, began to go to the cooperative meetings again. He would sit near the back and, when his eyes found Yusuf's, nod in a way that said more than sweeping apologies could. I also learned to look inward. Hatred had not only aimed at Yusuf, it had aimed at everyone who had held a role in the story. It had made me small and sharp. Forgiveness did not mean I forgot the harm. Forgiveness meant I would not carry the harm as a jewel, a prideful badge that kept me segregated from joy. One night I found Yusuf humming under his breath as he sanded a bench. The sound was an ordinary repair day sound. I thought of how easily I had wanted to throw stones and how much harder, and more miraculous, it was to lift a hand to pass a sandpaper and continue side by side. Months later, the cooperative held a small festival to celebrate the refurbishments, not to erase and forget, but to acknowledge the work and to make a public space where the town could come together. There was music, but not the kind that bludgeoned the week's wounds away. There was food, and older women taught boys how to fold flatbread. Yusuf stood by the table, passing plates without comment, a quietness about him that made his smile scarce but honest. When an old friend of mine offered him a seat, Yusuf accepted without ceremony. A few people crossed to shake his hand. Few did not. I married repair with a new practice. Each week I walked the cooperative's neighborhood with a small satchel of bread. I would knock on doors where I knew worry lived and leave loaves and conversation. Sometimes I stayed for tea. Sometimes the door stayed shut and the bread was left on the step like a small peace offering. Little by little, the satchel lightened the corner, because food is practical and practical things build trust quicker than speeches. Over time, something softer grew. Not the easy love people dream of in novels, but a steady reconnection. My brother learned humility the way a carpenter learns to read wood, by listening to its grain. He learned to be reliable where before he had been charming. Our family dinners included his laughter, now more measured, and our father sometimes clapped him on the shoulder. The town's ledger became less a register of losses and more a record of people who kept showing up for one another. If there is a lesson in what unfolded, and there are many, I hold this one close. Hatred is a fire that will claim you if you hold on to it as identity. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is choosing a different work to do with the same hands that once hurled stones. The teachings I grew up near do not arrive as rules but as an orientation, to patience, to repair, to charity without spectacle. They taught me that love often begins as a stubborn practice rather than a feeling, that it is fashioned by daily choices. To stay, to listen, to build. Years later, Yusuf runs the tool room at the cooperative. He is steady, the kind of man who knows his limits and loves the people who teach him better. I teach a small class on community repair on Thursdays. We talk about finance and food and the way sympathy turns into action. Sometimes someone asks me how to forgive, and I say the blunt thing I learned at a cost. Start with small, honest acts. Show up. Work. Let time do the part that pride never can. When I pass the cooperative now, I see people I know and they see me. We are not theater, we are neighbors. We have learned each other's names again, and sometimes, when the afternoon sun hits the doorframes, I catch my brother's eye and we smile in a way that says, without words, we have been humble enough to love.